Good day, amazing friends. Jeremy Mack here again. Well, the holidays are just around the corner. Fall has settled in here in upstate New York, and it is a perfect time to get our minds wrapped around, as woodworkers, what projects we're going to be working on as we shift into the holiday season. Now, a nice, elegant tray like this, serving tray, can be useful as a gift in terms of sales for you and your woodworking adventures, and also very handy in regards to entertaining family and friends. So for this tray, I'll be walking you through as a tutorial my process of hand cutting dovetail joinery, working with oak and walnut. We're going to put together and glue up a solid panel. Got some dados to set that in. We'll talk about finishing and assembly. Join me for this project. Let's do some measuring. We'll cut our dovetails out. We've marked the outsides of the boards. Let's zoom in a bit here. We're going to go ahead and measure the width of each of the pins that are going to come in. I know we're cutting dovetails on this, but the edge here will be the thickness of the pin. And I don't like my pins to be too thin on the edges here. I want them to be a little more durable with that end product. The tray is going to get knocked around a bit. And 3/16 of an inch is how far we're going to measure in for the pins on the edges here. And we'll remove that part of the boards. Now we're assuming here that each of these boards is planed thickness, equal in the dimensions, and nice and square. So we're aiming to have 3 dovetails on this board here. And I've added 2 additional lines, and those lines will be the outer edge of each of the dovetails. So we'll use our little marker here, our dovetail marker, and we'll place that over using a 1:6 ratio selection, that area of this cute little marker. Now there's 2 big things we want to tackle here. We want to determine where our dovetails are going to be going at the end of the board, and what spaces we're going to be chiseling out, removing, and we're also simply going to determine what each of the dovetails is going to look like, what angle they're going to be at. And what that ratio is for these angles represents the rise over run. So for every 6 units, so for this case, for every 6 inches, that's the run, the dovetail angle rises by 1 unit or 1 inch. The unit of measurement, like the inches or feet or meters, is totally arbitrary here. Our goal is simply to establish the angle that we want these dovetails to have. And for us here, what that would result in is a 9.5 degree angle. This is better for working with hardwoods. A more wide angle would work better for softwoods. So with our dovetail marker here, we'll go ahead and use the 1:6 ratio, which is labeled here. This cute little marker has 4 options. If you trace on the outside of that lower portion there, you get a 1:5 ratio. And the inside here, where I'm using, is 1:6. You flip it around, you get a 1:10 or a 1:9. It's a nice little tool. It's about a $12 marker. So we'll use this piece of oak here. That'll be the corresponding edge of the tray. And we know that thickness will help us determine what the depth of the area in between each of our dovetails is going to be. So we'll mark on all 4 sides on the dovetail board, and that'll help us know how deep our saw is going to get. Let's see about how far. I think it's just about 2/16 of an inch for that guy. So some people elect not to draw on the back. We definitely want to have our depth here on the back, but we don't necessarily need to draw dovetail edges where the pins are constructed through, as long as we're marked here nicely. Let's go ahead and do the edges. All right, looking good. We've noted the outside. I like to write my ratio 1:6. So you got everything marked away, you're getting ready to cut your dovetail. And I suggest creating a couple of very simple saw guides, jigs, whatever you'd like to call them. And there's different measurements depending on what angles you're working with. If you're working with a specific marker, dovetail marker, and angle guide, you'd want to make corresponding angle geometries like what I've done here. So you'll find these incredibly useful. and just help to expedite your process as you go. Less guesswork. So I've got this at the angle 9.5 degrees based on the 1/6 ratio for this area where the pins in between the dovetails are going to be. You can clamp this down in place if you'd like to. This is just a bit thicker than my stock that I'm cutting, but we'll just let this help hold it in place. As you can see, it can still move around. But the angle guide here is going to match up with what we're going to cut down into the wood there. I don't recommend sitting while you're cutting. Now, if you look closely, you can see that I'm using a crosscut saw with very, very fine teeth here. This is a Japanese Dozoki saw, and it is designed more for crosscuts, but with harder wood and finer projects, I grab for this rather than a rip saw. But definitely don't want to use a Ryoba type saw here. The difference being here, this Dozoki has a supportive spine. And if you had to choose between a Dozoki ripsaw or the crosscut saw, like what you see here with the fine teeth, if you had to choose one or the other, I would go with the fine tooth. You just work a little bit slower, but you're definitely not going to want to use a rip cut saw when you're doing the crosscuts on the edge. So let's use a simple coping saw here, and we're going to remove where our pins are going to be. In fact, I'll show a drill on the other side there. Lovely. We can chisel that out, or we can go at it with the saw a little bit more. All right. We're going to get in there with a 1/4-inch Forstner bit. And you just want to make sure while you're doing this that you're going straight in. And you want to be sure you come at this from the outside as well as the inside. That way you're not having to tear out as you approach the opposite side. Especially if the opposite side is your show side. Look how clean this. Look how clean that is from that Dozoki saw. So let's get started working on chiseling out some of the space where those pins are going to be coming through. Got my thinnest chisel here, 9mm. So when you're making measurements, make sure that your hardware is going to fit, especially if you're making tight little pins like this. Now, just to save some time here, I've removed one set with the coping saw and one set with the Forstner bit. We're going to approach from both the inside and the outside, the show side. So I'll show you here just because it's the same thing. Just approach that line slowly and remove some of that wood from both sides, face side and the inner side that's not being shown. To ensure that the pins are going to fit properly here in between these dovetails, angle your chisel inward, not just 90 degrees here. Start it at 90, but then bevel it in, angle it inward, just so you're removing a little bit less on the inside part that won't be seen there. That way you have a bit of a bowl shape within the area that won't be seen invisibly. That'll ensure you have a nice and easier fit. So let's go ahead and just continue working right up to the lines with some finessing from various sized chisels here. So we've marked out on our tray corresponding corners and which sides are going to be the show sides, the outsides. Actually, this edge is going to show, and the pins are going to penetrate through here, and they're going to show also. So we're going to brace ourselves here with a clamp. Now make sure you have your pin board perfectly aligned and parallel with that surface that you're going to be resting your dove board on.
There you go. Tighten her up.
So use some type of precise marking tool here, or a sharp mechanical pencil, and mark within each space in between and at the ends there of the areas between the dovetails.
Got some bridge lead. This out. Make sure we can see them. I think we're seeing everything very clearly. And let's mark what we're going to remove. This negative space. All right. All right. So again, let's ensure we don't lose ourselves here as we're hook cutting. The pins will stay there. All right, so we're going to draw on the edge of our tray here, the bottom of this edge, an archway, kind of like what you see here. I've measured out the center, measured and marked here, 1.5 inches in from the side. Same from this side here, 1.5 inches from that edge. And what I'm going to do is arc this piece of about 2 millimeter thick wood, just like this. You could definitely even use your ruler. So I'm going to use my clamp here. This is measured in 1 inch from the edge. I'm going to use these outer clamps to move in and out, just depending on where my ruler or my straight edge wants to go. Curved edge, definitely not a straight edge. You can put a nail here if you'd like to, instead of using a third clamp. Depends on what you have available. All right. So as this crosses my line here, I want this clamp to keep it in place. So let's move it in. Close enough for the moment. Micro adjustments, can adjust it to on off. Nice simple way to get a beautiful arch, and we're just going to cut this with a jigsaw. Bandsaw would be an ideal choice. I've just never made that investment myself. So let's go ahead and mark where we want to have our dado. It's going to hold our panel. Measuring down toward the bottom edge, making sure we're marking on the inside, marking the outside however you'd like to. Down on the top edge, we're going to have a 1/4 inch thick dado. That's how thick our panel is. And we got them all marked. This is what our panel's going to sit in. So I think we'll have enough structural support there.
So let's jump back in time here, and I'll walk you through the process of putting together our panel for the bottom of the tray. The two panels that you see here were cut from one single 1-inch thick piece of black walnut, and my goal was just to saw them thoroughly through with the table saw. I don't like to completely do a resaw with the table saw. This is about 7-inch thick pieces of wood, the panels wide, and so what I did was about 2 inches pass on each side with the table saw to sort of separate, and then a Ryoba saw just filleting basically and opening these up, and that's called a book matching style of putting together a panel. It's just a little over 1/4 inch thick, and I'll run each of these through my planer and we'll get the exact thickness. We'll do some sanding and we'll do a glue up here to make the panel for our tray. Now for a glue up like this, for the panel, it's going to be completely surrounded by the dado groove amongst the walls, within the walls of the tray. So we don't need to do dowels or anything between these pieces of wood other than glue. Modern woodworking glue is fantastic and more than enough for this glue up. If you haven't made a set of these poor man's clamps, I honestly grab these more than I grab my larger clamps because they're so convenient and simple. To activate the clamp here, all you do is put a little outward pressure and inward pressure on the top, outward pressure on the bottom. Watch for a little bit of squeeze out there. So let's set something a bit heavy on the surface to keep it a bit flush. You can clamp the ends of these, do whatever you'd like to do to make sure it's flat and flush, and we'll let this dry overnight. So let's go ahead and set up our router, making sure it's set at the proper dimension for the fence and also for the depth for the router bit. Just going to use a simple 1/4 inch straight bit for this. So we're at the router table. We're just about to start our dado grooves on the back with our 1/4 inch straight bit here. And I've got a couple markings. When you're working with darker wood, sometimes you're unable to see pencil markings. So sometimes I'll put a piece of tape just where I would have my pencil line. And for this instance, it indicates in this middle dovetail, that's where I want to have my plunge point start on the underside here as we go through the dado groove. So marking here with a piece of tape, continuing down, that would be my plunge point, but it's kind of a blind angle here. So the edge of that blade lines up with a piece of tape. So as I start my plunge cut here, and I submerge that blade on the underside of this piece of wood, I'm going to align those two pieces of tape there. That's how I know that that bit is going to plunge in at the right location within a blind area down below here. Now for the end stock portions for our tray, we don't need to mark ahead. We'll just run it right through because there will be no showing portion where the end of that dado groove would be visible. So before we assemble our tray, we're going to want to go ahead and cut out our handles. We'll use a 7/8 inch Forstner bit and a jigsaw to do that. And we'll just go ahead and get our measurements, marking first the center line and marking out whatever distance that we want for the thickness of our handle.
handle area. What do you think? Sound good? Leave me some comments saying how wide you make your handles. My favorite part about YouTube is learning from other woodworkers.
So let's head over to the drill press and remove some wood here. Forstner bits work best if they remain nice and cool, so we'll take many different short passes and we'll get through this wood at a slow rate of speed here. So we're going to plow right through delicately to that piece of wood down below, so sacrificial board, and it's okay to plow right through and not flip this over because for my intent I'm going to use a round over bit at the router. So a little tear out on the back side is not going to matter at all for us here.
Alright, let's make these handles happen. Let's do a little marking where our jigsaw is going to go. Let's load in a chamfer bit to our router table here.
I feel like the chamfer bit gives a bit more of a modern, a contemporary look than a round over bit, so went ahead and went with a chamfer bit. So let's continue on with that chamfer bit and just hit some of the outside edges that are just a bit easier to hit before final assembly.
Let's assemble this again. And we can see how everything lines up with the dado grooves, the handles. All right, here's our panel.
So let's double check for square here, and then we'll get started with marking exactly where we would like our panel to be. And I'll mark the inside edge here, the part that'll be generally beginning the visible part, and then I'm going to have this submerge into my dado groove exactly of a quarter of an inch.
Underneath, inside the dado, I want my panel to float, so I'm going to leave about 1 millimeter. So if we soften up those edges, it's more likely to glide in there a little smoothly for us. That is a little bit loose. There we go. Finally getting a nice picture of what our final product's going to be. Let's start to assemble this. We're going to put some glue on.
So we'll go ahead and glue up all these dovetail edges, and we will refrain from putting any glue where the panel is going to be. We'll do a little size up here and get that panel in place, but don't glue the panel in there. Leave about 1 millimeter of extra space. I dadoed in about 1/4 of an inch, and I cut the panel about 1 millimeter short of that in each dimension, just to allow for wood movement, temperature, and humidity changes. So let's slide that nicely squared up panel. That'll actually help us achieve perfect square with these lovely dovetail edges as we assemble this. So after the glue up, you can choose to let the glue seep out, just sit there and let that dry fully, or you can let it get to where it's a little bit tacky and you can scrape it away with a chisel then, or a chisel after it's fully dry. So as it's typical with dovetails, if you're not 100% happy with some of the joinery here, you can take some of that glue, mix it with some of the sawdust from whatever wood, walnut or oak or whatever you're working with. Mix some of that sawdust right in there, and this is just a palette knife, and just kind of assist it to go right in there. So after applying this homemade filler, we're going to go ahead and take this to the router with a flush cut trim bit, as well as do some sanding. So that's going to get rid of all this residue that you're seeing here, which looks quite unattractive at the part of this process. So after all the glue is dried, let's go ahead and head over to the router with a flush cut trim bit and ensure we've got a nice level set of dovetails and pins here, and also getting rid of some of the superfluous glue. Now you could easily do this with a hand planer or just some tedious sanding. So let's switch out the bit at the router to the chamfer bit and hit all the remaining edges, tops and bottoms, that we would like to, and go for that final aesthetic. And our next move will be just to sand this all down with some 220 grit sandpaper with a random orbital sander, and then we'll do that same 220 grit with some hand sanding in the direction of the grain just to get a final look. Alright friends, here's where I'm at with the finishing. I've put a preliminary quick coat of Watco Danish oil. It's the black walnut type. And I let it sit for about 5 minutes on the black walnut wood, the panel and the sideboards here. On the wall of the oak here, I didn't want that to soak in. I really dislike the look of darkening oak, but I did want to bring out some of the grain. So I used it as a grain enhancer, deepen the grain, and I wiped it off after about 2 minutes. Wiped it off after about 5 minutes for the remaining parts of the wood here, the walnut. So what do you think I should do? I've been on the fence about just doing, I love this paste wax. This is a clear, doesn't darken over time. It's easy to apply. Tree wax, awesome product. It's kind of my go-to. Gives me that perfect luster. But I've been thinking about trying some other products. What do you think about the bumble shoots? Hit me with the comments. Let me know how you would put that final top coat on. Or would you darken a little further with some further stain? Definitely go in oil, because I've got some of the oil, Danish oil in there now. Give me some thoughts in the comments, guys. I love hearing back from you about these things. But thank you for watching. Always a pleasure to work with you on projects like this. Don't forget to hit subscribe to keep the channel alive, guys. Thanks.